Welcome to the One Cell, One Light radio show with your host, Dr. Hildegard Staninger, commonly known as Dr. Hildy. And today's show is going to be very interesting for our audience and our guest. Our title of our show is Ancient Genes, Olmecs, and Bioethnicity, and my special guests are Aurora Sacarello, BioEthno Systems Analyst here at Integrative Health Systems, Robert Thollander, Jr., Molecular Biologist to cover the ancient genes, and international artist Rick Dubov, covering beyond the custom portals, the ancient art of the Olmecs, and Michael Edward, who's going to cover with us our ancient hieroglyphic glyphs that were the languages of the Olmecs. This is a special interest of me, the Olmecs, because after doing genetic testing, finding that I was ancient military elite assassin by the analysis that were done on DNA tribes and other genetic profile companies, you'll have a lot of list of information that is going to be connected to this show, and I invite our listeners and audience to look at the pictures, enjoy the history, what is going to be shared and discussed here. It's open discussion, and Bobby Thollander has a previous engagement. He's going to join us on the second half of the show. And before I go into our topic, I want to make a couple announcements. We had some winners on some of the prizes. We had the raw sugar juice was one, and also previous shows we had Robert and Rika won prizes in reference to the shows. Please look at the availability of certain prizes that are still available, and also for these shows that are coming up. Okay, so we are going to begin with open discussion of the Olmecs. In the history of the Olmecs and their art, which was shared by my staff when we went to the exhibit of the Olmecs that were here at the Los Angeles Museum of Art. We enjoyed the exhibit, and this was the first time that the exhibit was put on tour by Mexico. And for our listeners, the Olmec region that we're talking in history, which we have maps on the site, covers Belize, portions of the lower portion of Mexico, the Yucatan, Guatemala, Honduras, and I think there's one more city or country there that we will find for you. Okay, are we all here?
Yes, we are.
Yes, we are.
Okay. Aurora, are you there?
Yes.
Okay. Aurora, could you give us a little history of who are the Olmecs in a timeline, in particular with the term Mesoamerica? What does Mesoamerica mean for our audience? So they'll know, and then we can go into the art, okay?
The Mesoamerican region had a lot of civilizations in it, and from 1500 BCE, before Common Era, the Olmecs were considered the first civilization of the Mesoamericans, and known for a lot of kind of firsts, in quotes, for civilizations. They were the people that created the zero for the calendar. It's even possible that they did a lot of bloodletting in their rituals. And the first people to mine and carve jade, which I know Rick has a lot of experience with the artwork for the Olmecs, so we can go into that.
At that time period for our audience, when Aurora mentioned in 1500 BCE, before Christ, meaning this is approximately from current date 2011, 3,511 years ago. This meaning that this civilization, which was Mesoamerica, meaning the Americas, that is North America, Central America, and South America lined up. Mesoamerican being the first civilization on these continents. And from this beginning, which being the Olmecs the first, Then came from them the Tolmecs, the Aztec, the Mayans, the Incas, and so forth, into our other tribal nations that are known as the North American natives, and also the South American Native Americans. And many of the ancient genes are studied basically on the migration routes of these countries coming into other lands and in the trade. And also, as Aurora mentioned, the Olmecs were the first in trade, so that brought out a lot of different types of materials that could be traded, of them being original salt traders. The first, their name means rubber, Olmec does, in their native tongue, and also that they were the first, as we bring out in the artwork of the Olmecs, that they traded in jade that also became a particular jade that had the green hues in it and the blue, which because it was a blend of lapis. And which I have a theory, Rick, I do not know in media of art, and anyone else on the panel, if they know the answer, and really no answer is wrong, but where they mined the jade, which was in Guatemala, in the mines there, which is also when you find these particular forms of stones that they used in their artwork, you usually find salt, and this is where our Olmec, our Choctaw natural minerals come from. The thing is, I think it's very interesting how that they were among the first of anything, but they were notorious for being merchants. And then we'll go into the migration a little bit later in the show. But because of the tour that was done here in Los Angeles of the exhibits, and these exhibits are known throughout the world for a specific feature. Wouldn't you say, Rick?
Well, yeah, and a thought just dawned on me that, in these days, in our current world or in 20th century art, the artist was sort of, how shall I say, very independent and works out of imagination and a kind of individual freedom. But, I started to think, what was the role of the artist in the Olmecs? What was the role? Was it, was it bigger than just expression?
Right. How did it contribute? Because, Michael, during that time, they really didn't have a written language as we know it. They used symbols, glyphs. So their artwork may be also a symbolism not only of the beauty as we appreciate artwork, but of telling a story or telling some imagery of existence at that time.
I believe there's also been a lot of debate about whether that was truly Olmec language in some of these glyphs and things like that. The point is, which I think Rick was starting to bring up, the real point is the art, as the way I perceive it, with the glyphs and with the pictorial type of artwork, was a language in its own respect, and this is how they relayed things. I'm sure you know more about that, Rick and Aurora. I'm sure you know it more than I do, but those are the things that I've seen where it was a difference compared to when you go over towards Babylon or Sumeria, and you see a different kind of way that it's expressed to bring itself into the alphabet that actually came from those ancient areas. But from what I'm seeing is they didn't come up with an alphabet, so to speak. It was much, much more pictorial in what the Hopi and a lot of North American indigenous have passed on to say that this was Turtle Island. Right. Very pictorial with everything. Compared to other.
That's a good point, Michael.
Yeah, well, very pictorial. A picture said 1,000 words to them.
Yeah,
possibly.
A picture is worth 1,000 words.
I'm
Maybe
great at
that's
getting
where
it
that
mixed
came
up.
from.
Yeah, and audience, as we get into this, I want to. I always get excited on these shows and interrupt my guests, and I apologize for that. But if you can imagine in your mind of seeing North America with where South America connects to it and breaking it off, that is like when you look at the upper end, it's like a turtle, and that's what they called Turtle Island in Native American history and lore. The thing is that in each one of these stories, there is a story of migration, whether it's from the stars, whether it's from the lands, or other civilizations. Basing on human civilization, yes, we know that it can go back 6,000 years to the Sumerians, and Aurora, you correct me on the timelines, or there's another pre-race before the Sumerians, as Michael Brent mentioned, the Babylonians, 4,000, 3,000 years ago for the Egyptians, etc. Where we are with the civilizations, as even comparing to ancient China civilizations, the Han lines and the Tartars and the 7 tribes of the Mongolians, etc., because of the Bering Straits where they walked over the Bering Sea, at the polar cap. The thing is, a lot of the top trade, or I would say best sea captains and that were of the Japanese, Chinese, etc., meaning on the Asian sides coming to the west coast of the Americas. And the Olmecs were known in trading with Chinese, which I think is very interesting, because if you look at their artwork, even like the wrestler that they have, some of the features of the art are a slender build person, a person that has, I'm going to call it almond eyes, more Asian features, versus African features, versus on the the east coast of the Americas, there was, and I know, Michael, you have a show coming up in the future in reference to Alexander the Great and all of, I'm going to call it Egyptian and that, coming to the Americas. In other words, and Rick brought this out to me from last week when we aired a different show, that or 2 weeks ago, in reference to the Americas were, because of the raw materials and everything, were like the international trade routes of commerce as compared to the world. The Buddhist monks that would come over on the Chinese boats over to the Americas were among the first, even in Fusang, in 499 BC, AD. That's 500 years into after Christ. That they documented different civilizations that occurred, like the Aztecs, etc. This way, and told those stories back to their lands, because they would come and migrate and spread their own word within, for a number of decades, like 30 years, and then go back home to the homeland. So there's a lot of history, but I think a lot of things that are going to be revealed as we get further into this topic.
Which indicates that there was a whole history of America that goes way back, long before the so-called discovery of Columbus.
Right. Mm-hmm. And what was the country that, quote unquote, we know that Italy and Europe, et cetera, this way are very popular in the game soccer, but was it, I'm talking only from the European side, not from the Olmec side on the Americas. Aurora, do you know if it was the Greeks or anyone playing with like a soccer game? There was beg pardon?
The predates the Olmecs?
Well, yes, because the Olmecs were basically, say it's 3,511 years ago, and they had not only the blood rituals, but they played the game just as the other games.
Like the Mayan civilizations and everything is similar to like basketball. It's a very, very primitive, different version, but it's a very different kind of game. So they kind of invented a game like, that's what I'm saying. They're the ones that were the first to invent a game similar to basketball. So
Yeah, but they would run like soccer and hit the ball. And the ball...
Yeah, they would kick the ball into the hoop. That's what I'm
right.
saying. Like, the hoop is above, so it's similar to both soccer and basketball. It's like a combination, but they were the first ones to do a game like that. So it's always referenced to it being a game that derives from that area.
Right.
Aurora, I have a question for you, or just I'm going to throw this comment out. I've heard about people who have even backdated the Olmecs further to more like 3000 BC. Have you read anything about that?
As far as Mesoamerica?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not an expert of Mesoamerican history at all.
No, I'm not either. I just read, that people have suggested, and based on what evidence, I don't know, but that I'm sorry. No, they're backdating it even further.
Yeah, as technology grows and as we uncover more about the civilizations and we notice different similarities in, let's say, the hieroglyphs or anything of a different culture, we're noticing that they do, in fact, predate from our original thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it even goes into the pyramids that they've found underwater in Japan, that if they discover that they are, in fact, man-made, they predate the Egyptian pyramids by 5,000 years, which is a huge deal. So, it's dealing with something like that. Like, as science goes on and as we find out more and uncover more, we do find. But as far as I know, I haven't said anything.
And it's like if those, those pyramids predate that are off the coast of Japan, and if they exist, since they had the earthquakes and everything in that area, that might be remnants of Atlantis and other things that different expeditions are out there trying to prove that do exist. And as we're seeing in science, which is future shows on artificial biology and cloning and that many things that we thought were mythology are in fact coming to be about as through the advance of science and technology. And the thing is that with each one of the Olmecs being so old in America, and even if they were predated by another first, I find it very interesting. There is Olmecs were very notorious for this too, which I think is very interesting, is they would bet on anything. They had, I'm going to call it the gambling gene, and there's an advertisement on TV, and Rick and I have discussed this in the past. This is a little sidebar, audience, that this medication that you take will, for restless leg syndrome, will cause you to gamble. But it's not gambling as just betting, and going and getting a lottery ticket. It's usually gambling $100,000 or more, okay?
Isn't that interesting?
And I always teased Rick. I said I would love to study these people to see or enter into that pharmaceutical company and to negotiation and to study to see if they had the ancient Olmec gene, because maybe that was just trying to express itself.
Well, maybe in Las Vegas they've started putting it in a food in Vegas, hoping that the casino do better.
With gene therapy and nano delivery systems, anything goes, Michael, as we know. Yep. We can change our genes, or it's like we have the current debate here. If you're in, you are Dr. Hildy, and if Dr. Hildy puts a blanket over herself, is she still Dr. Hildy? Because the new gene just covered her up, which is the blanket. So is it still there? Yes. My theory is, and hypothesis, is that it is still there because it will always be covered or expressed. It's just a matter of the ancient evolutionary proteins that have to be expressed, and where are proteins kept? On the cell membrane. And the more pollution that we get exposed to, the more cover up there is.
So in other words, you can cover it up, but you can't hide it forever.
You can't hide it forever. Once that light just sparks out there, it's going to come right out,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'd like to interject this thing here, Dr. Hildy.
Yes.
Which is, but as you know, our friend Dr. Joseph Farrell, who's written so many wonderful books, I first emailed him, almost coming up on 4 years ago after I read The Cosmic War, in which he talks about giants and all the legends, even in the Bible, about giants on the earth. And I suggest, and this is how I met him through this first email, and I suggested, those Olmec heads, the big ones, about 6 foot tall. I said, maybe they're not just the imagination of primitive people. Maybe they're realistic depictions, and if you scale them up, you're going to get a 35-foot human creature. And I think you touched on this a little bit before, that it's not, just primitive people with, wild imaginations. Maybe they're telling real stories.
Right.
I think they are.
And that they're proportional. And at the same time, as Rick pointed out, if you look at the picture of the Olmec colossal head, that was like the head itself was almost 7 or 8 feet length, with approximately 4 feet wide. Okay, and if we just look at the cranial features, meaning these colossal heads were also exhibited with always having a hard hat on them. Like
kind of a helmet,
like a primitive football helmet.
Wow.
That way. Also, they always bring out that it had more African features, etc. But if you look at the African race and you look at how the migrations that were occurring, not only from Africa, but also from the Aboriginals over in Australia. And then you have the New Guinea, you have the Fiji, the Samoan, the Hawaiians, etc. All of these Polynesia or Pacific Rim nations with their lineages and everything. You've got to remember that if you were a good sea captain, had good compass and good crew, you could sail around anywhere as long as you had enough food and water on those ships, or knew where to dock to get supplies. And there could be a lot of migration that way. But what is the interesting feature, not only in these colossal heads, bringing back just on the topic of giants as brought out in the artwork, as Rick brought out, and also referencing Dr. Farrell's wonderful work, in Genes, Giants, and Monsters and Man, the thing is that giants, and that reference was referenced in Babylonian times and throughout, I'm going to call it the Mediterranean, the Cyclops, etc., this way, meaning giants, over that way. Over here, this, and correct me if I'm wrong, this apparently for Mesoamerica is the first of, I'm going to call it giant, but looking at the squarish of the heads, there's a whole other concept that can occur from the genetic side where migration of, I'm going to call it giants, over the Arctic Circle, etc., this way. In the dwarf sides of Greenland, and that which was on the north side was the Skraeling, Skraeling civilizations. They particularly had a very unique feature, which is, if you look at that ancient colossal head, a four-cornered head, high cheekbones, heavy jaw, large angular eye cavities, and a retreating forehead. We really can't see the forehead because of the hat on it, the helmet. But when you look at the other features of the artwork that are shown on the thing, we see that the head can be elongated, but the ones heads that showed the, I'm going to say the features of Asian civilizations or Asian genetic traits, they didn't have that elongated head.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and also in this, and this was done with Fusang, that he brought out in his writings that were done in a beautiful book that is called I got it right here, Fusang, or the Discovery of America, being that the Chinese discovered America as our Mesoamericans are living here. that it brought out that the colors that were used in the dyes of the Peruvian tribals, which goes into, if you want to call it the color categories, which are stationary, the yellow, the red, the blue, the green, etc., this way, also matched the vocabulary as to how that civilization was addressing itself in its, I'm going to call it mankind to spirituality relationship, which I find very interesting that this is brought out because the basic colors being like the colors of your chakra.
Mm-hmm. You know, Hildy, as you mentioned that, which was so interesting, I will give you my immediate intuitive reactions as I've seen the giant Olmec heads. Is at first you say it's African, but then there's something else in there that is not African. In other words, it's some kind of really peculiar kind of face. I don't know if that,
Right, and that's what I'm trying to say. It's a peculiar face, and we could look at maybe the giants were the guardians over here, if that was to depict, an actual proportional sized entity, meaning person or giant. Okay. Now,
if I
go ahead.
Interject, I do apologize. I know we briefly touched on the subject of the helmet on the Olmec head. Now, the research that I've gathered from the Olmec heads was that the majority of them were depicting royalty, people in high places. So a lot of times they would make them larger as kind of a show of reverence, for the person themselves. So a lot of them were royalty or rulers, high priests, and the headdresses would be something that those people would wear.
That's a good point.
That's just research that I've gathered. But, granted, that's something from people like archaeologists or anything finding and making the assumptions. So we could assume a whole bunch of things, but that seems to be the general reaction towards those heads. And that
but at the same time, Aurora, I think they could be the royalty might have been giants from remote antiquity.
Entirely possible. But you can also look at it as a lot of the statues from antiquity itself are larger than the actual person. They're done on a larger scale to show that they were more important, or their importance in the civilization.
Well, that's
also. They could very much be giants, but there's also the whole stylized artistic view of they're just showing them larger than life.
Yeah.
Right. But a lot of ancient texts do speak about giants in land. In fact, that is out of I've got a total blank here.
It's okay. Don't worry. We'll fill it.
That's what happens. See, I'm writing down what you guys are saying, and I'm thinking, oh, boy, I've got some questions. So now I forgot to write down that one. But okay, giants in the land, yes, and you just can't refer to that as mankind, so to speak. You have to put the factor in there talking about giants being the gods, as the giants were called at that point. Was that because of their leadership? Well, in a certain respect, yes. Was it because of their size? Also, in a respect, yes, because even Enoch, there's the book I was trying to remember, in Enoch 1, it's the same thing where there was the cross between the angels, the spiritual, and the human women, and then of course there was humanoid interbreeding and everything else. Yes, they were giants, and it's not just Enoch 1 that speaks about that. It's also been written in lots of other myths and in lots of other prophecies. But I've got something. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I apologize. I was just saying, actually, Enoch, the book that you were speaking of, is actually it was the most popular book by early Christians in like 100 AD, or whatever it's called, CE now, Common Era, because of the fact that it had such mythological creatures that they were used to in their own culture and lore and history and everything. But the Vatican decided that it wouldn't be put into the Bible because of those specific reasons.
Well, no, because they didn't want to have to share gods with their creation of their own type of god.
Good point.
Because the giants of the land at that time that is spoken about in Enoch and in some other books, even in some of the Gnostic and of course Enoch comes out of the Essenes writings, and even with the fragments that have recently been found since the 50s. But that's competition when you think about it, according to Rome.
Right,
you can't speak about gods because there's this push that there's only one God. Well, yes, there is only he, she, mother, father, let's say creator God, but it was very plain in a lot of the books, and especially Enoch, exactly that these beings, they were not man, they were not angelic, they were a combination. They were considered gods even in Babylon, and even in Samaria, in what became Persia, they were considered gods of the earth because of their stature, their size, and such. So perhaps with the Olmecs, that could be some of the tie with them of their statues and these figures of the faces and the heads and everything being so large and such large scale, as you all said before. I've got one goodie that I'm going to hit you all with that I want you to think about this. In North and South and Central America, Turtle Island, there have been artifacts that have been found all throughout the Americas that are almost exactly as older Phoenician artifacts and even Roman symbols and such. And I think that's been part of the problem in Central America with the Olmecs is it's been confusing where it's not accepted that it could possibly be that pre-Mediterranean Babylon civilization could have darn well begun on Turtle Island here in the Americas.
Right. And some of those,
a lot of people have got to start thinking, as Rick, you said, things have been going on. Columbus really didn't discover the Americas. No, I've got one for you, and here's my theory. I really believe that Olmec land, if we're going to call it that, the Americas, Mesoamerica, I really believe this was Atlantis.
Very
or a portion of it, yeah, because there's portion of it, meaning down in the bottom. It could be sunken in the sea.
We have all these ancient artifacts that resemble artifacts that are found along the Mediterranean and such in Egypt and in Sumeria. We have all these things that are here in the Americas, and when an archaeological team goes there and looks at it, they're going, well, that can't be.
Right.
That can't be. What are we going to do about Columbus?
Right.
Right, and there's parts of Peru, and I'm going to call it Argentina, the eastern coast of South America, where you can trace bloodlines, meaning, several thousand years back, meaning over 2,500 Phoenician, Iranian, etc., because those civilizations' names keep changing. It's like what was studied in reference to the Assyrian and the Scythian.
Well, that's why I was bringing this up, Dr. Hildy. Was the big thing about this show is ancient genes. So I was bringing that up to hit you with, okay, can you back that up that, it was way before Columbus? Do the genes actually
definitely.
show that?
I want to bring that out, and I appreciate that question. I take it, okay?
Okay.
In a recent article that was done on August 26, 2011, meaning very recently, there is a Dr. Shasa Lessin, Lessin, who's at the Anthropology, College of Anthropology at UCLA, who did a paper on the princess DNA holds the longevity key. The concept being, or the thought being, that in the book that was done by Sitchin in 2010, there were giants upon the earth on page 162. Enki, E-N-K-I, initially withheld genes affecting longevity. Okay? This is the statement quoted out of the book. They have found that the Nabirian Homo sapiens that was on the earth 450,000 years ago, and with his sister Neman and their son in South Africa, meaning these are names, audience, of different archaeological finds. When they find a rune or a Homo sapiens, they gave it a name, okay? That these Homo erectus, meaning standing up straight Homo sapiens, were 300,000 years ago, and they were used in the slave mining. The thing is that they had 223 genes on this particular genome of Homo erectus, and the genome of Homo erectus did not match the other genes except for the portion of the longevity, which they are trying, meaning in her article, brings out that if they were able, if anyone was allowed to go into the British Museum where these ancient, I'm going to say these archaeological finds are for Homo sapiens and Homo erectus, they could match to what Sechenitsin matched and show that the ones that had the longevity had inherited the short stature and also the demigod hybrid. Thus, in her paper, which I recognize, it brought out that possibly environmental factors. Everybody's looking at the changing of the genes as relation to bacteria, fungus, viruses, and all that type stuff. In reality, you should also look at what was being done to the races to poison those races, and also what was, not races, but these civilizations, and what was also their exposure, okay? Example being the Olmecs and being the first to express and make rubber, their exposure. But in any of this, it's the leading thought that through the study of the mitochondria of the DNA, which would show the female side versus the other side being regular DNA versus not mitochondrial DNA, would show the link from the, I'm going to say, the father side versus the mother side on the mitochondria, and prove that this wild humanoids or group were totally distinct from the giants, totally distinct from the other Neanderthals. Mm-hmm. Now, in the Neanderthal study, which was done just recently on the same day in San Francisco, a research team was an article written by David Perlman on the 26th, same day. They were looking at the Neanderthals, which were, again, 300,000 years old, and that what they were studying on their genomes, in particular the Denisovans, Denisovans, which was the contemporary Neanderthal, that they matched more of the New Guinea, the Fiji, etc. scores for their genome, but did not match directly Homo sapiens. That means that then it was a total different gene pool, okay, if that's true. Then what they were using, which I use in my practice, is the HLA gene, which is the human leukocyte antigen, which is on the cell membrane of the ionophils. There are little sensors that give you approximately 14 different combinations that can give you different antibodies to fight off different chemical exposures, or like viruses, etc. This way, and that's what they were studying, is that the ones that had this specific protein group of histocompatibility, that these would protect the human that had more of them, so that then they would be protected from diseases, etc., that could have wiped out the various civilizations. Now, when we see too much of the HLA genes being, I'm going to say, overstimulated, they use this also for, transplant, tissue rejection, etc. studies. What we found is that you become chemical sensitive until you clean it off. But the ionophils, after they're formed in the thymus net, they go through the bridge of the nose, interact with the olfactory senses, and whatever you smell or exposed to would come there. But audience, what is, if we have a Neanderthal and we have, different races, different genetic pools, what would be the first antigen beyond a snake bite or a dinosaur? Would be smoke. The inventive fire. That is the first antigen that ever any human being or anyone was exposed to that would come out, the carbon.
Wow. That's interesting.
Well, I could explain with so many of indigenous American civilizations where smoke is not only ceremonial but also is considered medicinal.
That is quite right, Michael. Yeah, you bet. It's a grounding.
Even with the pipe, it's very sacred for North American indigenous anyway to be a holder of the pipe. And even going, and I'm thinking real quick here, even going into Chaldean, Hebrew, Babylonian, ceremonial smoke was important. Very part of, I don't know if I'd say it was religious sacrifice, but definitely sacrifice in one form or another for various gods. So, wow, that fits, Dr. Hildy. You just hit on something that, wow, I'd never thought of it that way.
Yeah, well, science is coming through, even down to designer babies now, but that's another show, right, Michael? But there is so much history and so much things to discuss. I would like to get into, if you'll bear with me as my guest, from the art standpoint, there's different materials that were used, because we got to look at, one is a great trade civilization. The area at that time, probably just as it is now, is well aerated, well watered, rich soils, etc. But how would they cut these colossal heads? Did they use lasers? Did they use a hammer and a chisel? Did they have that? Because some of the artwork that I saw at the museum, which we have, meaning there was jade masks that were done, and we're going to talk about the war jaguar babies and other things that were shown. Some of their axes were actually made out of stone, but also I didn't see much metal. I saw jade, meaning their currency, I feel, was jade, or the rare blue jade.
Well, I also would add in, Dr. Hildy, that you wonder, if beyond trade, you wonder if they considered the energetic nature of the materials that these pieces were carved out of, as in a related subject, the crystal skulls.
Right, and that's going to be on our show in November on the 16th, because the crystal skulls on the Mayan side are traveling across the United States and will be in Los Angeles for 11/11/2011, and I'm having a follow-up show thereafter. But I think you're totally right, because when you look at the ancient codex of what they talk about, the medicinal plants and stuff, they also bring out in the translations which were done, and I don't know the priest's name for the codex, when the Spanish conquistadors came to Guatemala and those areas where the Incas were and the Aztecs, the Incas. The thing is that they brought out that there was specific balls, like I'm going to say like the size of a penny or a dime, that were carved that they would use or put on their body for healing purposes.
Whoa! Yeah.
Even in the sacred temples, which were the jaguar temples, which they had kept. I think they kept real jaguar in there, like a real animal. And when that animal died, they have exhibits where they had pictures where a whole skeleton of the jaguar, but what they put in the jaguar mouth, which I find very interesting, based also on Asian philosophies or traditions, is that they put a ball of jade into the jaguar's mouth, versus the last Empress Cece of China before the revolution in China. She had a black pearl put in her mouth. It was custom to put the rarest pearls in their mouth.
Well, yeah, there's some research done that they were saying that they put the jade in the mouth of the dead as money, as a sign of the renewal of life.
Right, just as like in Roman times, you would put 2 coins over the eyes to pay.
That was more of like those payment to get across. It was kind of like the renewal of life, because they kind of considered this the blue-green colors of the stone as life itself, like because it reminded them of like the water and the sky and their vegetation, the colors of it. So it was kind of a symbol of life. And they also considered it, like you were saying before, that it had medicinal properties. They considered it particularly good for the spleen, liver, and kidney. So when the Spanish came, they were very interested in it for trading, and that's kind of how it got its name, because it was kind of a play on the words of it meaning lionstone in Spanish.
Right, and also when the Spaniards came, for trade and conquering and et cetera in those times, they also were well knowledgeable of, I'm going to call it that, international trading from Chinese, Japanese, different trade routes and everything, because that was really when the time of whoever was trading on the west coast of these lands then would also hear about who was trading on the east coast, whether it was for battles or anything, but it was quite interesting. And also, as you mentioned, Rick, many of their artwork having the pictures with, whether it's a bird, it's a face, or any of those, like an amulet, they would use for, I'm going to say, more power. Example, like when we have seen the work of crystal studies, crystallography of Dr. Emoto, that when you write certain words on it, the crystal lattice of that water molecule, when it's frozen, changes. It gets not in a perfect hexagon or not in a perfect crystalline shape. It gets distorted. And this may be another situation, with on the medicinal and the healing aspects, especially the energy in many stones. Especially they used a lot of magnetite, which had a magnetic nature to it, due to the composition of its metal alloys within it.
Yeah, well, interestingly, and Joseph P. Farrell, in his books, his trilogy about the Giza Death Star, about the Great Pyramid in Egypt, talks about that the thing is largely a crystalline structure, meaning limestone, which has a crystalline structure, and the other material, the more polished stone. And when it is compressed, it creates electricity. So,
right, which can be used as for many purposes that at that time, I would imagine.
Yeah, but and we've kind of all touched on this, so that there was a human history that's much older than the one that we were told we have.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that would include the continent we live on.
Yeah, we just might be the continent that brought the knowledge to the Greeks, and they spoke about this great land of Atlantis. And it's not really all that far out to think of it that way. And I'll give you an example to back that up even further. In all of the Americas, so many indigenous civilizations speak in their prophecies and in their myths and in their lore, their true history that's been handed down generation to generation, and even written in their pictorial glyphs and such. They speak of what many of them, if you translate it, they speak about the pale prophet. And what's so odd, this was the peacemaker. But he was pale. He was pale-skinned compared to them. Some even say, light-colored hair, blonde-type hair. Why is it that within all the Americas, so many indigenous people have the same myth, if you want to call it that, but definitely a prophecy? They have that about this pale prophet who brought peace to them to stop them from warring and things like that. And all of them will tell you that was about 2,000 years ago.
Very interesting.
Right. And I've read books where, it mentions the children, too, coming out because, let's put it this way, not too many people wanted to stay in Jerusalem or anything after those times because there was a lot of battles and, you had to get out of Dodge, as to say.
Well, could it be that this pale prophet was everywhere at about the same time?
Yes, that's that's an excellent point.
It's as if, and I think a friend of ours, Harry, had mentioned this to me when he and I were speaking. He believes that time, the element of time, stopped about 2,000 years ago during this appearance of the pale prophet or Christos or whatever name you're going to put, whether you're talking about Son of God or the peacemaker who came and stopped the wars among those who were living in South America, what we call South America now. Perhaps time did stop, or perhaps because there was a spiritual aspect with that he really, this peacemaker was seen everywhere at the same time. My point with all this is history overall tells us that America was discovered, not too many centuries ago. The reality of the prophets from different civilizations say that that's not true. In fact, it's beginning to show more and more that it's a total lie from Christopher Columbus on about, him discovering Mesoamerica. It's a total lie because the artifacts don't agree with that. The myths and the civilizations don't agree with it, though many were wiped out by Europeans as they came to where they can't tell their stories anymore. But nonetheless, they left the records to show, and the prophecies and their lore has been handed down and kept from generation to generation, and it goes way, way long before, even to the point of more than 2,000 years ago, and that's just folklore, so to speak.
Yeah, and I have a question, Michael. Is this white prophet that appeared everywhere, is that synonymous with Quetzalcoatl?
Yes, because that's really how that translates, as white prophet. Or the white prophet, or the pale prophet. Same thing.
That's the one with the bird feather robe too, correct?
Right. In fact, there many of them that I've read about in the Americas. Again, I'm talking about north, south, central. Many of them talk about the white robe that peacemaker wore all the time, and some do, some don't. But it's to wake us up to get this modern false history, and it really is false, this modern false history, this modern history about the discovery of the Americas by Columbus and all this. It's just totally not true, and there are just too many artifacts, there are too many discoveries. Do you know that the Americas, there are so many pyramids And this is even the ones that haven't even been uncovered. I was in Mexico in the 80s, and I was outside of Mexico City near Puebla, and of course that is a very true Indian, native Mexican before the Spanish came area. In fact, you want to talk about the facial features looking very much like the Olmec features on what they've left, and they have their heads the same way. But while I was there, I was taken into areas in the farmlands. They're all farmers, and I was taken into those areas, and here you have an active volcano not far away, and you go and look at this hill, and you say, well, okay, so there's a hill there. Well, it's not a hill; it's a pyramid, and there are many of them that the natives there in Mexico will not talk about because they don't want the government, they don't want others to come in there and basically destroy what their civilization has as its only remnant. So you see a lot of this there that's never spoken about in books, and some of the artifacts that I'd seen there and told by memory reminded me so much of Egyptian hieroglyphics.
Wow. And also, the suggestion has been made, and I think Dr. Hildy, I don't know if you read Joseph's new book, Grid of the Gods.
No, that's the only one I have, and I have to get that one.
Yeah, but the suggestion that there was once a global pyramidal or tetrahedral society, and one piece of evidence outside of Central America, Mexico, South America, is that the biggest pyramid on Earth is in China.
Well, we're going to pick this topic up as we go into ancient genes, Olmecs, and bioethnicity on the second half of our show, and with my guest, Aurora Sacarello, Michael Edward, Rick Dubov, and Bobby Thollander, Robert Thollander Jr. Okay, we'll get that on the second half. Thank you.
Informed, enlightened, alive and amplified. This is the Living Light Network.
Welcome back, audience, to our second hour of our show, and our topic is ancient genes, Olmecs, and bioethnicity. We left our first part at the end where we were talking about, Michael Edward was bringing out to Rick Dubov the topic of, we were talking pyramids as related to Mesoamerica, and then go to China where Michael was sharing with us that there is the largest pyramid there. Could you elaborate more, Michael, please?
Actually, it was Rick that said that, but I agree with him because I've also read the same thing.
Right, and I want to.
And I, Dr. Hildy, I have only seen a photograph of it, and it looks, as many of these pyramids look like mountains, but the angles are very sharp, and maybe it was once had some sort of other material on the top of the four surfaces. But this one is huge. It's it's many city blocks long. It's bigger. It's actually bigger than the Great Pyramid at Giza. So,
and how old is that one? Because some of these pyramids, I know in South Africa, runes, which were done where they did the Adam's calendar. Looking at that last what do you call it? Rune, a stone rune, which was. That was 75,000 years old. So a lot of these runes are coming up to be older than some of the Neanderthal civilizations that we discussed earlier in our show, if they were 30,000 year olds, versus 300,000.
Yeah, and I think I think Michael kind of touched on this, that we're talking about really remote antiquity because they date, the Egyptologists who were kind of full of baloney. Are dating the Great Pyramid at what was it, 2000 BC? Am I right about that, Michael? It's a really
some are, yeah.
Yeah, and then Robert Schoch, the geologist from Boston, has backdated the Sphinx to a conservative number of 8000 BC. And as I understand, he was brought over there to look at it, and he saw the water erosion within the pit that the Sphinx sits. And his first comment, just right off the top of his head, he said 100,000 years old. But he had to, make his estimate conservative because he's an academic and he, has a career and,
Well, that's the problem with the pyramids that do exist in the Americas. The academics, the textbook says that America shouldn't have those pyramids. America shouldn't have the artifacts that are being found. We shouldn't have the bones that are being found here. We shouldn't have the skeletons of 9-foot-tall people that have also been found in Europe and actually all throughout the world. We're not supposed to have that in the Americas. See, according to modern history, it's been rewritten. Those things don't exist. But the problem is they really do. And the pyramids do exist. The conquistadors especially had the natives, those in Central America, whether it's Guatemala or what we call Mexico now, they had all the locals, when they came in and conquered them, wherever they would find their smaller pyramids, they would make mountains out of them. They would have to bring the dirt. Now, I've been to 3 of those, so I know exactly what I'm talking about by seeing them myself. And then they would build a church on the top of that to sanctify it. And this is where a lot of churches in Guatemala and Mexico, especially, churches are on the top of what looks like a hill. Don't dig down 20 foot. You might not like what you see.
Wow. That I didn't know about. That is fascinating. Covering up the evidence.
Absolutely. And it was, to take the dirt, cover up the evidence. So many pyramids have been discovered in Mexico where they went to go build a road, and all of a sudden they're getting perfectly squared pieces of rock that are building blocks. So when they, go in there a little bit more, then they find out, oh my gosh, it's a pyramid. Well, there's a church at the top of that hill. This is how the conquistadors covered up and so-called conquered the Americas. Well, fine, they tried to cover it up, but the truth remains that whether we're going to call it Olmec, whether you're going to call it Aztec, whatever name you're going to put on it, Mayan, these civilizations are at least as old, if not older, than those civilizations around the Mediterranean, whether it's Greek, whether it's Egyptian. They're just as old, if not older, and yet our modern academia does not want us to believe that.
Yeah,
but the artifacts and the proof shows different.
Yeah, right, and the materials, not only were they made out of stone, but some of the temples were also temples, but also meaning pyramids that also had temple meaning for religious or worship type areas. The thing is that some, like the Temple of the Jaguars, which were in Chetsites, and for the Mayan pyramids, they were lined in jade, and if you went into it and you clapped your hands, it would sound like the Quetzalcoatl bird that was native in that species area, and also the most sacred of birds. But it would hear that perfect harmonic. And many of those things, if we look at the genes of how can you cover up a gene, as we know, by other foreign genes or other foreign proteins, so that it doesn't express itself or turn it off or on. But if we had I'm going to say, a pre-ancient gene that is beyond what we know as civilizations as related to the creation of pyramids or beyond, by looking at all the junk DNA, whether the junk DNA is the creation of protein complexes as associated with the poisonings that you may be exposed to in, I'm going to call it generational lifetimes, meaning 5,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago? Or is it that through those harmonics of those temples, wherever they are in the world, that they allowed, like in Egypt, the temples of beauty would allow you to be more beautiful, because maybe through the which I know it can happen, the harmonics would allow the toxins to leave your body and you would become less free radical damage and become younger? Or would it express some ancient pre-existing gene that, as it links to who you were linked genetically, demigods, etc., under that concept? Wow. Example, the ruling class of the emperors of Japan, the first emperor was Jimmu. We use it throughout our literature because I love the story of Jimmu, Emperor Jimmu and the dragonfly. But he was supposed to be descended from the sun goddess, which is a deity, okay, in their, in their beliefs, in their whole history. And that was the golden chrysanthemum. The thing is that if that was, say the lands, because Japan, again, as an island or any of these, say these were all one large land mass before continental drift and the many different earth changes that occurred. And being that, I'm going to call it the pyramid that's in China, maybe it had other things, because, as Rick said, there was a flat surface. Many of these, except for the ones in Egypt, and I stand corrected, Aurora and Michael and Rick, correct me, they're always pointed, versus these other ones, like in the Yucatan and maybe in China, because I haven't seen that picture, they're flat. I don't know about the ones under the sea in Japan, but, they're like flat on the top. Maybe...
Hildy, let me interrupt you real quick, because
yes,
and I don't want to, but your other guest has
Bobby
just chimed in, and he's here with us.
Yeah.
Now.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Bobby. Thank you for
Bobby.
coming on. Let me introduce you properly. This is Robert Thollander, Jr., a molecular biologist and secondary education instructor teacher in the Chicago area, correct, Bobby?
Yeah, that's correct. It's good to hear from you.
And I appreciate you being on. We have Aurora, Sacarello, Michael Edward, and Rick Dubov. We've had the first hour was in reference to our review of the Olmecs, and now we're discussing ancient pyramids and how in the Yucatan the pyramids also are similar to Egypt and also to China. And we left it where maybe it's the expression of ancient genes through acoustical measures within the pyramids.
Oh, and by the way, Dr. Hildy, you forgot to mention, you introduced me, Rick Dubov, as Rick Dubov, the artist. Bobby, you have an artist in your presence.
Good to know.
Who is an architect of the universe to create custom portals, which are very magnificent to the ones that have those. Bobby, so you can catch up with us, and I appreciate you being on. In this discussion, we were talking about the flat tops of the pyramids because many of the aspects of genetics where we're looking at giants and other civilizations, looking at predating the Olmecs or anything of that nature, because a lot of the sciences are now looking at the proteins that can cover up some of the ancient genes or the ancient aspect of a gene, especially with what I'm seeing with gene therapy that can overlap your pre-existing genes so that another genetic nationality is expressed.
And Dr. Hildy, what happens, so in other nationalities expressed, but what happens when those genes are covered up by proteins? What types of, physical changes are seen?
Well, that's it. It may be that, example, like with the gene therapy that was developed at the Belarus Institute, after exposure to radiation, the Russians after Chernobyl, there was a lot of mutations, et cetera, so they made a gene therapy to guard you against radiation poisoning. Say you were injected with that or got it, you would have the Belarus gene, but would your own craving for certain ethnic foods be expressed or not expressed? Maybe you have a new, I'm going to say just in generality, just in food craving. Because as we've seen, as you become cleaner in removing toxins from your body, the ancient genes get expressed and you crave certain ethnic foods. I've seen that with patients and stuff like that because you need those whatever is in that food. You might need more jalapenos than you would normally never eat, just only baked potatoes. I'm just using that as an example. Because back to your question, the gene is still there. It's just not being expressed because it's either turned off, covered up, or coated over. Prime example, am I Dr. Hildy if I take a blanket and put it over me? I'm still Dr. Hildy.
Right.
I just can't do anything because I got the blanket, which is, I'm going to call it the foreign DNA or the foreign protein, or how they're modifying HLA genes, et cetera, this way, or cells so that they can go in. Now, if I take that blanket and I roll me up like I was in the movie with as Elizabeth Taylor did as she met Julius Caesar as Cleopatra, and she unrolled the carpet, if I tied those ends of those carpets that made another form of protein not expressed or unfold, is it still the same or is it laying dormant? For some event in the future, maybe a certain protein that is tied off just as a rope at the end of a rug, would that break under certain acoustical harmonics just as a crystal? Because a lot of proteins are expressed as liquid crystals. The viral component is whatever is contaminated within the cell or floating around. That's how in nanotechnology of DNA folding proteins, what they do in the DNA origami, making those crystals, is using a plasmid of or an aspect of the virus so that they can maintain the shape, because usually viruses, when you look at them, have beautiful shapes and images. When you look at it in the scanning electron microscope or other advanced materials.
And what you're talking about reminds me of when I was taking molecular biology and in genetics in college, and we were talking about epigenetics and how toxins can be transferred from grandparents to parents to children based off of those types of epi meaning above. So it's like you're saying, covering up the genes that are there.
Right, and the prime example I've seen in my professional career is arsenic. You could have your grandparents' well contaminated with arsenic due to landholding. We're talking at the turn of the century if you were raising cattle and sheep, as to say in certain areas they didn't want those flocks, or even 200 years ago. Turn around, that could still be in the water. You're still exposed, and at the same time you had whatever your grandparents or your lineage had in you and expressed. And that particular compound stores in the skin. So one is, we know it stores in the skin, but it's really in the cells. And it loves to accumulate in the mitochondria. And some of these mitochondrial genetic reactions that we're seeing and clearing up or getting worse, is it because these foreign compounds, being like arsenic, getting stuck in the mitochondria, not allowing cellular respiration, and thus not, having the accumulation of carbon monoxide? Why do you turn red after you run? Yes, because you don't have enough oxygen there, but maybe some people are redder than other people. Why do people blush? Is it because arsenic is stuck in the skin and you cannot get rid of the carbon monoxide as you blush? These are just comments. These are just statements. There's really no right or wrong answer to my panelists and audience, but it's just statements to make you think. You know, it's like in the red races of China, which they had, you know, even General Kung Fu was red. They always thought from the sun and everything, but then when they go back, they see the bloodlines of the Tartars and how that interacted with the Mongolians, because the Tartars were known to come over the Baltic Straits and into the Americas. So, you know, meaning we got Eskimos at the top. What I'm saying is if we go pre or epi Olmec to whatever is before the Olmecs, if there is, as Michael brought out in the the artworks, and we go forward, we could say that the races on or nationalities on Mesoamerica, which go into 1,500 approximately living tribal nations within North America alone, they all come from a possible common root. Maybe even not. I'm just throwing that out there.
I'd agree with you. Just too many. Not from obviously, I'm not a geneticist, not from a scientific point of view, but from my point of view of studying ancient texts and different prophecies and different folklore and such, I would have to say you're absolutely right that I really feel that the cradle of civilization, so to speak, and that's just using it as the term, is here in the Americas.
Wow, that's a very interesting idea.
That is a very interesting comment. Do you have any comment, Aurora, on that?
Like I said before, anything can be possible in theory. It's very probable. The more we go into scientific testing and being able to do maybe tests on the ages of fossils and how far they go back, carbon dating, we find out completely different history than we know. So I think it is entirely possible.
Right. And even looking at the art, just using the example, whether it's genetic, whether it's cradle of civilization, in the Olmec history and what was found in their runes was the artwork, which they call the were, W-E-R-E, jaguars, which were the were jaguar babies. These babies, which were depicted as being like a werewolf but a jaguar, and in their religious shaman, they would take a shaman of Olmecs would take the skin of a jaguar, put it over their body, and basically shapeshift or do whatever they do as a were jaguar. The thing is, the babies, when you look at the artwork, it's describing, and I'm going to read right from the artwork. Common motifs include downturned mouth and a cleft head, both of which are seen to represent were jaguar babies. From a science standpoint, are we describing a birth defect? You know, cleft head.
Yeah, I mean, from a science that's autosomal or trisomy 23, that's a Down syndrome, sounds like.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you have more of what Down syndrome audience, a mongoloidism, etc. this way. Now, in my early career in aerospace, years ago, I had to investigate pregnant women in the workplace that were exposed to bisphenol A epichlorohydrin. These were a two-part mix. We hear a lot about it with the baby bottles having the bisphenol A, etc. But back then, we're talking almost 32 years or 31 years ago, not much information was there outside of is it cancerous or is it not. But what we found in industry, meaning the aerospace industry, that women or men that worked around this compound, it made that chromosome 23 sluggish. So if you were 21 years old, where normally you had to be like 35, 40 years old, older lady having a baby, would have a Down syndrome baby, young women and men and men, because it would do the same thing on the men because of the chemical exposure, would have Down syndrome babies. Now, I'm going the next level, okay? The next level being the Olmecs were the first to use and are known, that's what their name means, rubber. They were the first to use the rubber tree and cook it, meaning the latex residue from it, cook it and make, bottom sandals or use it for coatings, etc. this way. We know that epichlorohydrin bisphenol A is a combination of a rubber, a polymer, okay? Synthetically, that's what I'm saying, synthetically man-made compounds, versus a natural occurring compounds like in rubber, and you're cooking it and making it, you can have original compounds that could be of that same nature. Now, would that give them more features of what we're seeing or experiencing? Because you got to remember too, at least in my thought, the older the gene is at that time, meaning way back then, there was less pollution, even though it might only been fire or the metals or the stones that you used or grind and inhaled because they didn't have respirators or anything. But you were exposed less to, unless you were some kind of military or an assassin, which they had, like their own little special ops there. They would be highly trained generationally in the various poisons, which were either a golden tree frog, a snake, or scorpions, or whatever was there, because you would have to build up a resistance to it, because, number one, they'd probably use it on you. Because you were in that field,
Wow. So there's a long history to these ops.
Well, when you look at any military application of a civilization, the military goes out and conquers the land for the nation and the ruler of that nation, okay? With anything, you have to have a good military to overcome a lot of stuff. But when you look at the ancient civilizations, there's a lot of features there, with...
Well, look at excuse me, I'm sorry.
Go.
But, Joseph, in his trilogy, the Giza Death Star books, he's basing his work on the work of Christopher Dunn, who wrote the first book about, he's an engineer, he wrote the first book about the Great Pyramid being a machine. It was actually a machine. The moving parts are missing now. And then Joseph, I think brilliantly, took it a step further and said it was a weapon. And it was a weaponizable item. And in fact, he quotes the Assyrian, the early texts on it, and they refer to the pyramid as the Great Affliction. So it just gives perspective on the fact that these kind of operations have been around for a long time.
Right.
And may I throw a curveball in here right now? An interesting one, though. We talk about DNA, and I became very interested in the work of the biologist Gaston Naessens, who is in Canada but is originally French, and his work on the somatid. And in fact, it turns out he is like the 50th scientist within over a 100-year period who described these things under the microscope in the blood, which are dancing kind of indestructible energetic particles. He called it the somatid. The first one to see it was Antoine Béchamp in the 1870s, and he called it the microzyma. And this is a great study that no one's doing, which is and Naessens calls the somatid the precursor to DNA. And I think this is an amazing study. If anyone ever wanted to do it, and he's done experiments, repeated experiment of, for instance, isolating somatids from a black mouse and injecting it into a white mouse, and the white mouse starts growing black hair, and then vice versa, just the reverse. And apparently these little dancing, charged, durable particles are indestructible to radiation, excessive heat, anything. So I just find that interesting, you know. And I'm not an expert on it. I just read about it, and I thought it was really fascinating.
Yeah. Does anyone have any comment? No, I guess the room. Go ahead, Bobby. Go.
I was just going to say I haven't heard of the somatids before, but they're very interesting.
Yeah, it's very fascinating.
But you're saying he described them as a precursor to DNA? What is a precursor?
Yeah, in other words, because he actually literally isolated, with no DNA involved, he isolated the somatid. He's repeated this many times, isolated it from a white mouse and injected it, a white-haired mouse, and injected it into a black-haired mouse, and the black-haired mouse starts growing white hair, and vice versa. So that both mice became gray, ultimately. And then the other very interesting thing was he took cubes of fresh meat and injected them with somatids, which and sealed them hermetically, and the meat started growing. It's quite interesting. All I can, and I'm not an authority on this. I just think it's very provocative and very interesting. So maybe I'm just thinking, and I'm an artist, and a thinker. I think I'm an artist, philosopher, and I read.
You're a scholar.
But it's very interesting. Maybe, DNA, as important as it is, may be part of a higher chain of command. In other words, these somatids may contain levels of information that are above the DNA itself, but are certainly involved with DNA. So there's
like
my curveball.
Yeah, which can be like a link between physical and, as I call it, stardust or anything into other types of matter.
For instance, Béchamp, the first one to discover these, he had a chalk sample, natural chalk sample that was 1 million years old, and he added water to it, and he found these buzzing electrical particles called he called the microzyma. And so, in other words, they were locked in time in the stone, and then once water was added to them, they became alive. So, anyway, I think it's fascinating, and that should be a whole study project. What's the relationship between the two,
Yeah, that might be future shows. I know I might have Mesoamerican pyramids of Mesoamerican and other things, and we might have the same panel guest here and just open discussion on it. But with any of this, time will tell, but so much is happening so fast in the world of science, genetics, any of this stuff. It doesn't matter now. The thing is, the tools are being made so that you can prove your theories or you can address it that way. So I think all of us will see a lot of these answers definitely in our time here. And it's going to be very distinctive. Even like we had the earlier discussion at the beginning of the show in reference to the colossal heads, where they all had the helmets on it. But in my further reading here with my literature here, I also found that no two of those heads were the same. In other words, each were individual. That's based on somebody that was the model. Example, like what was done with the 4,000 soldiers, the terracotta soldiers that were found in China in those tombs. Each one was different based on an image of a real soldier.
Yes. Interesting.
So that goes back to your thought that maybe through the arts of the Olmecs, that these colossal heads were real giants.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because and you mentioned the Book of Enoch earlier, and I read that years ago, and they were very specific. They talked about giants, and they were very specific about the height of them. And as I recall, it was something like 35 or 36 feet high.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as I looked at the Olmec heads, and I said, well, what are they, 6, 7 feet tall? And if you want to add a body to that in scale, then you've got something like 30, 35 feet high.
Yeah, we've got, according to some of the ancient texts, we have the giants, the 35-footers, so to speak, that you're talking about, that Enoch and other texts have spoken about. They were the giants of the land, but they were always specifically shown as being the gods simply because they were not totally human according to everything so far that's been written about that we're just now finding, especially within the past 100 years. And a lot of that's been suppressed as well, I might add. Mm-hmm. So you've got those. You have the gods, the giants that roam the earth. Then you also have, besides them, you have the combination of them with mankind.
Interesting. Yes.
So then you start getting into not quite as large giants, and you have these humanoid hybrids. And again, these ancient texts back that up. So those are not the gods. They are, as it's been put in some cases, gods among men, because they're half man. And that's where so many religions have taken these ancient texts, and especially modern Christianity, and especially Roman Christianity, which is where it all really kind of got put together, has taken those older texts and tried to say, oh, no, they can't apply because they're saying that was a god. And yet if you go back into going to the root words of these ancient languages and you start to find out what exactly that word giant means, you find out that it really means like God in one, or another will say that it was to the point of literally giant, as if in a god. Okay, so modern religions have deliberately tried to hide the truth of whether it's genetics, whether it's the giants, which is really genetics. That's the only way that the true history can be hidden, and that's exactly what's happened for so long. And I really feel that we're at a turning point where they can't hide it anymore.
Right, I agree with you. The truth is going to come out. It's just like we pointed out before Bobby came on the first part, when those princess genes that are done through the relics of Homo erectus and Homo sapiens and the Nibian in the British Museum, if those were ever tested and compared, we'll have some answers to the giants, as just as written about there were giants on these lands, that Sitchin wrote about. And also the heads, back to the heads, meaning of these giant images, the heads were made out of volcanic basalt, B-A-S-A-L-A-T, and that particular type, they needed single blocks. Would you say, Rick, of that material to carve those heads?
And I didn't get a chance to see them in person, but the rock is kind of pitted, isn't it?
Yes, it's pitted, and I will say for primitive times, very smooth, and those rocks are heavy. And I would add this, Hildy, as a painter, I look at those heads, and I mean, those things, they're not just a sculpture of a head. They are so imposing. The expression and everything is so imposing on the viewer, Right. I agree, and those features in that. But the one that we have an image of the first one that was shown, which was on the Tres Zapas area, because there was it's called Rancho La Cobota, Cobota, Cobata. I apologize for mispronouncing it, but my Spanish gene is covered up with my other genes right now, you know. The thing is that there was a lot of miles to go between these areas, meaning one was on, I'm going to say the Yucatan Peninsula, which was San Lorenzo, which was on the western side versus the eastern side, and the two types of volcanic basalt are not, they're the same stone, but they're from a different area of the Mexican Yucatan, you know, peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
And for one to efforts, you know, it might take 1,500 people to move it for 3 or 4 months to get it to where they were found. That's what I'm saying.
And I'm also, really struck by the artistry, the technique to carve something like that. That's, I'm very impressed by it.
Yeah, and Aurora, from your research, did you find what they used to cut these heads, or do any of their jade work or anything like that?
The jade work themselves, they speak about making tools that were actually made out of jade to carve the jade.
Oh, so that would be from a science standpoint, that would be less friction, and also because we talked earlier on the program, because some of these stones had different metals in them, so that they would have a magnetism, or a magnetic field, that they would have less resistance that way, in having something crack like a diamond faster than what it was needed,
But
Go
also
ahead,
possibly to the stones and even the shapes of the stones, but whether it was jade or whatever stone, the harmonic qualities of how they react to harmonics and the sounds, and all throughout the world, that's starting to be known very well. Whether you're talking about the Himalayas or whether you're talking about South America, a lot of things are showing about how things are affected so much with harmonics according to their ancient civilizations. And I feel that's a lot of the reason why the pyramids were built the way they were. In fact, a lot of people have proven that, even with the Gaza pyramids, but also with the ones here in the Americas. The stones that are used are at a certain shape or of a certain texture for a reason. It's not by mistake because they look pretty. It's just way beyond that. It's jade is pretty. There's reasons behind all that. We just kind of have to constantly make ourselves look outside the box of what we've been told, what the textbooks say, because they're just flat out wrong.
I'll chime in with the somatid because Naissance has proven, photographically, with film under this microscope he created, how the somatid, when an organic thing, whether it be a plant, animal, or human, is dying, what it does is it becomes chameleon. It's indestructible to begin with, but it becomes a double spore, and then it becomes a bacteria, and the bacteria becomes a fungal form. It goes through a 16-stage cycle until it creates a thing called the thallus, and it releases more somatids to continue. And as Béchamp said, this brilliant man that he was in the 1870s, the somatid creates organic life out of the mineral state of things. It starts with the mineral, and then returns it to its organic state, creates it out of the mineral, and then upon death, takes the organic being and brings it back to its mineral state. I don't know why I brought that up, but it seemed to rhyme with this whole thing about minerals,
Yeah,
right.
mineral alchemy. Go ahead.
There.
I'm
I was
sorry.
just going to say that too.
Oh my God, yeah. Because the whole, bottom line is the mineral state and its harmonic resonance.
Which goes
Perhaps.
back to our earlier conversation with the temples. And did you have something to say, Aurora?
Well, I was just going to go into the fact when you were talking about the harmonics and the jade. That's entirely possible, considering we discussed that they were used as a healing stone, something that they considered to have healing properties. So maybe even the harmonics, the energy field that the stone itself creates, they don't want to disrupt it with an energy field of something else. So if they're carving it, even when they mined it, they used the same mineral to carve it out, as to not kind of, I would say, taint it.
Oh, interesting.
Right. It was the purity. It was, meaning it wouldn't be tainted that way.
Still having properties within it. You're not in any way distorting it.
Right.
Wow, that's a good point. Wow, to not contaminate it.
Right, and a lot of their earthenware, was clays, et cetera, so they'd have more minerals that way, and they ate, sweet potatoes, greens, corns, yucca, those types of foods. They also ate whatever the local, I'm going to say reptiles were, snakes, et cetera, fish, et cetera, during that time period. Which those, I'm going to say, foods in particular having more plant vegetation and greener and more minerals in it, et cetera, would go probably that because somatids are also not proportional to the chlorophores, which make up the different chlorophylls or the different colors, the pigments of the plants and stuff like that. But Olmecs had a very unique trait when they would before battles, or many of those Mesoamericans, the Aztecs and that, there was different clans which were the Jaguar warriors and the Eagle warriors, but the Jaguar warriors, which were I want to say the elite military side, or like the Royal Guards, et cetera, this way, or Special Forces, they would take a honey that was done and made through an orchid. And in particular, many people don't know that different orchids have like a vanilla bean. And I find it very interesting that they would make this drink before they would go to battle and drink it for endurance, etc., this way. So, and back then, I don't think they lived to be beyond maybe 30 years old. What do you think, Bobby?
I agree. I'm just kind of stuck on the concept of the somatids. I've been thinking about it, and they kind of and looking it up actually on my computer, and thinking about this book I read recently by Lewis Thomas about the light. It's called The Lives of a Cell. And he talks about cells, and I learned a lot about this in a lot of my classes, and I teach my students about this a lot, about how our complex eukaryotic cells are actually a combination of different organisms, that we aren't, like, if we were to think of ourselves as being human, we're human, our cells are human, but inside of our cells, we also have components that we're never human, that we're basically, that are symbiotic, they're permanent symbionts, like our mitochondria, essentially can be traced back to being a prokaryotic cell that combined with a eukaryotic cell. Same thing with if you were to trace the evolution of eukaryotic plant cells, and their chloroplasts can be traced back to being the chloroplasts are symbionts, have a symbiotic beneficial relationship, and so kind of like the mitochondria reproduce themselves. They have their own genes. They have, even some of their genes are inserted into our genes. And these somatids, in the way that they were described as being indestructible, if they are actually not necessarily indestructible, but if they are also symbionts, and that because a new discovery of a symbiont, if they are there, just kind of like how we're newly discovering quarks in this field of physics, that these may be a new symbiont that are existing within our cells that have some sort of undiscovered importance, or some sort of life cycle stages that are important, that are changes in nutrition or changes in any sort of physical aspect of your surroundings may affect your health.
Bobby, it's interesting you brought that up because, and I address this to all you guys, that I've always found it weird that, you'll see a person on the street or you have a friend and you look at their face and say, they look like a bird. They have bird features. Their nose and their eyes, they look like birds. Or another one looks like a horse. I've always just been curious about that.
Well, some look like a dog, so.
Oh, well, thank you.
I've seen a bear too.
Yeah, bears. I've seen all sorts of animal forms in people, and it's not like I'm hallucinating. I've actually seen it.
What we're saying is that at that quickness of the eye, or you look at the features as related to anatomy or pictorial books that you've looked at, you see those features, and and some of this. If we look at just foreign DNA being the food that you eat, they found a lot of DNA of frogs and different amphibians because some of the Cambodian, Vietnamese, et cetera, would eat those types of foods. Doesn't mean that they're a frog or anything, but they have that DNA in them, as to what you eat. Meaning, if you ate a lot of cow beef, you probably have a lot of that foreign DNA. But it goes back to with the Semites, as you could say, a quote from the Bible or anything, from dust to dust.
Well, that's
the
what
Semitic
Antoine
was
Béchamp.
A speck of dust.
That's what Antoine Béchamp said in 1874. Because they're everywhere. And by the way, Bobby.
Yes.
Since the Somatid interests you, and this is for the audience, of course, as well. There's a great essay by Christopher Bird, B-I-R-D, about Béchamp, and you can find it online, and it's real interesting.
Thanks for giving me that reference.
Great. And we'll have on the show our staff link up to Christopher Bird's essay on it so others can have it readily too. And also, with the features of the Olmecs from the genetic standpoint, the thick lips, the eyes, the heads, many, we're looking at the African side, but there was a art historian that out of Mexico that did a collection of all of these Olmec artwork pictures, and his name is in the 1940s, Miguel Corrobas. And he noted that the carvings of the Olmecs had 7 braids.
Wow.
On some of them, where they were trying to, at that time, 1940, saying, well, this was an Ethiopian hairstyle, et cetera, or Nubian braids, or Egyptian. But in each one of those other civilizations, they only had 1 or 2 braids. They didn't have 7. So I honestly don't know if the 7 means anything, but I found it interesting that they would use 7 braids,
But Hilda, what is, again, I'll go back to those big heads, and I look at them and I say, who is this? Are they black? Are they Asian? Or, that it's just like the faces are so unusual. And you can say, oh, yeah, there's an African look. But I say, it's kind of an Asian thing in there, too.
Well, that whole reverence or that whole implication is based just like you made earlier in reference to you seen a horse or a dog or anything.
Right.
Meaning it's because that's what we're using is from what our libraries are, what we have looked at, what we have done. I mean, some of us haven't even traveled out of the United States, in America. Some haven't even traveled out of the city that they live in. But through libraries, through internet now, we have more knowledge. But it goes back to what is the root of it. And you stated to me years ago, and I love this statement because it was ideal always with far infrared, because I do know that the less pure far infrared you have in your cell and body and the organs is when cell death is occurring, meaning that goes out proportionately as death and disease go in. The thing is, remember you were saying in Taoism that you're here physically on Earth, and then you have your star constellation. Go ahead, Rick. You say it much better than I do.
As Dr. Wu, who's a expert, he's a true Taoist, and he said you're born from a star. There's like a descending lattice of information that comes down to Earth. And when you are born, not at conception, but when you are born, you split off. It's like a scission. It's a split off, and you become a human being, but you're still in that star. And a lot of the Qigong practices is to get you closer to the star you came from.
Right, and in this, if we take that concept and that thought, what if we purify beyond our DNA, those epigenetics, which would be, who knows the future, Bobby, you might be proving somatids related to that match the dust not of this earth, but the dust of a constellation. Because far infrared, no matter if it's a frozen star, which is the beginning of a universe out in the galaxies of beyond, matches the same frequency as the far infrared within a human being or any living form. That is proportional to that temple and how much acousticals, how much cells, whatever it is, to distort the signal, distort the frequency, or whatever may be happening. And yes, audience, we can prove this scientifically with right budget or even a shoestring. The thing is that it does exist, and it is going to be coming about in it. It's like, and I'm going to throw this out there, like 3 weeks ago they had the fertilization of 150 million human eggs with foreign animal DNA, whether it's a frog, a fish, or whatever it would make. What in the heck? What are we doing with those?
Yeah.
And at the same time, is this going to be the new zoo of, hey, let's go see your miniature cyclops? I know I had a person that was doing a paper when we were doing years ago with, what do you call it, chimeras. And turn around, there was a company that actually would make one for you and sell it to you over the internet. And so I'm hearing our music in the background.
Oh, yeah.
So that means
been a
to our
time.
audience and to our guests, we're getting close to the hour and to the time, and we have beautiful native music, so it's nice.
Hildy, it's amazing how the time flies in that second hour. We get warmed up and...
I know. We take the first hour to get warmed up. And audience, I hope you enjoyed the show. And I want to give special thanks to all of my guests, Aurora Sacarello, Bioethno Systems Analyst, Robert Thollander, Jr., Molecular Biologist, Michael Edward, Ancient Text, and also international artist and specialist architect in custom portals, Rick Dubov. I want to thank you all for being on the show, and I welcome all of you back anytime, and maybe you'll all share your thoughts on pyramids of Mesoamerica in the future, okay?
That would be a great subject.
I know. I love it. There's a whole website, a site out there that has beautiful pictures, and we can discuss the architecture and the materials that were used in it to build. Also, I want to make an announcement. Next week, we're going to have a two-part show, which is going to be from the filmmakers on the attic door. And Aurora, can you announce those guests on that show for me, please?
Yes, we have Daniel Deneau, Erica Harrell, and Eric Ernst.
You got it. They're the ones who made that movie. And the second half I'll be on, and I'm going to discuss a particular products, Chakma, because they're based on the formulations of the Olmecs and other Mesoamerican civilizations. So we can bring out the medicinal botanicals of that time and how it's related to this time. Because through what you eat and what minerals you may have may express your true genes. And who knows what that junk DNA is, right, Bobby?
Right. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And soon
nice
to be
meeting
discovered.
you, Bobby.
Yeah, because we
Nice
know
meeting you
Bobby's
too.
going to have a new project called somatids. Okay.
Yeah, why not?
And we're going to prove it, and then we're going to show how your junk DNA is related to the stars and everything else, and that'll be all in the future. Thank you again, and God bless to everyone.
Informed, enlightened, alive and amplified. This is the Living Light Network.
A thought just dawned on me that, in these days, in our current world or in 20th century art, the artist was sort of, how shall I say, very independent and works out of imagination and a kind of individual freedom. But, I started to think, what was the role of the artist in the Olmecs? What was the role? Was it, was it bigger than just expression?
Right. How did it contribute? Because, Michael, during that time, they really didn't have a written language as we know it. They used symbols, glyphs. So their artwork may be also a symbolism not only of the beauty as we appreciate artwork, but of telling a story or telling some imagery of existence at that time.
I believe there's also been a lot of debate about whether that was truly Olmec language in some of these glyphs and things like that. The point is, which I think Rick was starting to bring up, the real point is the art, as the way I perceive it, with the glyphs and with the pictorial type of artwork, was a language in its own respect, and this is how they relayed things. I'm sure you know more about that, Rick and Aurora. I'm sure you know it more than I do, but those are the things that I've seen where it was a difference compared to when you go over towards Babylon or Sumeria, and you see a different kind of way that it's expressed to bring itself into the alphabet that actually came from those ancient areas. But from what I'm seeing is they didn't come up with an alphabet, so to speak. It was much, much more pictorial in what the Hopi and a lot of North American indigenous have passed on to say that this was Turtle Island.
Right.
Very pictorial with everything compared to other.
That's a good point, Michael.
Yeah,
well,
very pictorial. A picture said 1,000 words to them.
Yeah,
possibly.
A picture is worth 1,000 words.
Yeah. I'm
Maybe
great at
that's
getting
where
it
that
mixed
came
up.
from.
Yeah, and audience, as we get into this, I want to. I always get excited on these shows and interrupt my guests, and I apologize for that. But if you can imagine in your mind of seeing North America with where South America connects to it and breaking it off, that is like when you look at the upper end, it's like a turtle, and that's what they called Turtle Island in Native American history and lore. The thing is that in each one of these stories, there is a story of migration, whether it's from the stars, whether it's from the lands, or other civilizations. Basing on human civilization, yes, we know that it can go back 6,000 years to the Sumerians, and Aurora, you correct me on the timelines, or there's another pre-race before the Sumerians, as Michael Brench mentioned, the Babylonians. Welcome to the One Cell, One Light radio show with your host, Dr. Hildegard Staninger, commonly known as Dr. Hildy. And today's show is going to be very interesting for our audience and our guest. Our title of our show is Ancient Genes, Olmecs, and Bioethnicity, and my special guests are Aurora Sacarello, BioEthno Systems Analyst here at Integrative Health Systems, Robert Thollander, Jr., Molecular Biologist to cover the ancient genes, and international artist Rick Dubov, covering beyond the custom portals, the ancient art of the Olmecs, and Michael Edward, who's going to cover with us our ancient hieroglyphic glyphs that were the languages of the Olmecs. This is a special interest to me, the Olmecs, because after doing genetic testing, finding that I was ancient military elite assassin by the analysis that were done on DNA tribes and other genetic profile companies, you'll have a lot of list of information that is going to be connected to this show, and I invite our listeners and audience to look at the pictures, enjoy the history, what is going to be shared and discussed here. It's open discussion, and Bobby Thollander has a previous engagement. He's going to join us on the second half of the show. And before I go into our topic, I want to make a couple announcements. We had some winners on some of the prizes. We had the raw sugar juice was one, and also previous shows we had Robert and Rika won prizes in reference to the shows. Please look at the availability of certain prizes that are still available, and also for these shows that are coming up. Okay, so we are going to begin with open discussion of the Olmecs. In the history of the Olmecs and their art, which was shared by my staff when we went to the exhibit of the Olmecs that were here at the Los Angeles Museum of Art. We enjoyed the exhibit, and this was the first time that the exhibit was put on tour by Mexico. And for our listeners, the Olmec region that we're talking in history, which we have maps on the site, covers Belize, portions of the lower portion of Mexico, the Yucatan, Guatemala, Honduras, and I think there's one more city or country there that we will find for you. Okay, are we all here?
Yes, we are.
Yes, we are.
Okay. Aurora, are you there?
Yes.
Okay. Aurora, could you give us a little history of who are the Olmecs in a timeline, in particular with the term Mesoamerica? What does Mesoamerica mean for our audience? So they'll know, and then we can go into the art, okay?
The Mesoamerican region had a lot of civilizations in it, and some 1500 BCE, before Common Era, the Olmecs were considered the first civilization of the Mesoamericans, and known for a lot of kind of firsts, in quotes, for civilizations. They were the people that created the zero for the calendar. It's even possible that they did a lot of bloodletting in their rituals. And the first people to mine and carve jade, which I know Rick has a lot of experience with the artwork for the Olmecs, so we can go into that.
At that time period for our audience, when Aurora mentioned in 1500 BCE, before Christ, meaning this is approximately from current date 2011, 3,511 years ago. This meaning that this civilization, which was Mesoamerica, meaning the Americas, that is North America, Central America, and South America lined up. Mesoamerican being the first civilization on these continents. And from this beginning which being the Olmecs the first, then came from them the Tolmecs, the Aztec, the Mayans, the Incas, and so forth, into our other tribal nations that are known as the North American natives, and also the South American Native Americans. And many of the ancient genes are studied basically on the migration routes of these countries coming into other lands and in the trade. And also, as Aurora mentioned, the Olmecs were the first in trade, so that brought out a lot of different types of materials that could be traded, of them being original salt traders. The first, their name means rubber, Olmec does, in their native tongue, and also that they were the first, as we bring out in the artwork of the Olmecs, that they traded in jade that also became a particular jade that had the green hues in it and the blue, which because it was a blend of lapis. And which I have a theory, Rick, I do not know in media of art, and anyone else on the panel, if they know the answer, and really no answer is wrong, but where they mined the jade, which was in Guatemala, in the mines there, which is also when you find these particular forms of stones that they used in their artwork, you usually find salt, and this is where our Olmec, our Choctaw natural minerals come from. The thing is, I think it's very interesting how that they were among the first of anything, but they were notorious for being merchants. And then we'll go into the migration a little bit later in the show. But because of the tour that was done here in Los Angeles of the exhibits, and these exhibits are known throughout the world for a specific feature, wouldn't you say, Rick?
Well, yeah, and
very, very primitive, different version, but it's a very different kind of game. So they kind of invented a game like, that's what I'm saying. They're the ones that were the first to invent a game similar to basketball. So
yeah, but they would run like soccer and hit the ball, and the ball.
Yeah, they would kick the ball into the hoop. That's what I'm
right.
saying. Like the hoop is above, so it's similar to both soccer and basketball. It's like a combination, but they were the first ones to do a game like that. So it's always reference to it being a game that derives from that area.
Right.
Aurora, I have a question for you, or just I'm going to throw this comment out. I've heard about people who have even backdated the Olmecs further to more like 3000 BC. Have you read anything about that?
As far as Mesoamerica?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not an expert of Mesoamerican history at all.
No, I'm not either. I just read, that people have suggested, and based on what evidence, I don't know, but that
I'm sorry.
No, they're backdating it even further.
Yeah, as technology grows and as we uncover more about the civilizations and we notice different similarities in, let's say, the hieroglyphs or anything of a different culture, we're noticing that they do, in fact, predate from our original thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it even goes into the pyramids that they've found underwater in Japan, that if they discover that they are, in fact, man-made, they predate the Egyptian pyramids by 5,000 years, which is a huge deal. So, it's dealing with something like as science goes on and as we find out more and uncover more, we do find, but as far as I know, I haven't said anything.
And it's like if those, those pyramids predate that are off the coast of Japan, and if they exist, since they had the earthquakes and everything in that area, that might be remnants of Atlantis and other things that different expeditions are out there trying to prove that do exist. And as we're seeing in science, which is future shows on artificial biology and cloning and that many things that we thought were mythology are in fact coming to be about as through the advance of science and technology. And the thing is that with each one of the the Olmecs being so old in America, and even if they were predated by another first, I find it very interesting. There is a Olmecs were very notorious for this too, which I think is very interesting. Is they would bet on anything. They had, I'm going to call it the gambling gene. And there's an advertisement on TV, and Rick and I have discussed this in the past. This is a little sidebar, audience, that this medication that you take will, for restless leg syndrome, will cause you to gamble. But it's not gambling as just betting, you know, and going and getting a lottery ticket. It's usually gambling $100,000 or more, okay?
Isn't that interesting?
And I always teased Rick. I said I would love to study these people to see or enter into that pharmaceutical company and to negotiate and to study to see if they had the ancient Olmecs 4,000, 3,000 years ago for the Egyptians, etc. Where we are with the civilizations, as even comparing to ancient China civilizations, the Han lines and the Tartars and the 7 tribes of the Mongolians, etc., because of the Bering Straits where they walked over the Bering Sea, you know, at the polar cap. The thing is, a lot of the top trade, or I would say best sea captains and that were of the Japanese, Chinese, etc., meaning on the Asian sides coming to the west coast of the Americas. And the Olmecs were known in trading with Chinese, which I think is very interesting, because if you look at their artwork, even like the wrestler that they have, some of the features of the art are a slender build person, a person that has, I'm going to call it almond eyes, more Asian features, versus African features, versus on the the east coast of the Americas, there was, and I know, Michael, you have a show coming up in the future in reference to Alexander the Great and all of, I'm going to call it Egyptian and that, coming to the Americas. In other words, and Rick brought this out to me from last week when we aired a different show, that, or 2 weeks ago, in reference to the Americas were, because of the raw materials and everything, were like the international trade routes of commerce as compared to the world. The Buddhist monks that would come over on the Chinese boats over to the Americas were among the first, even in Fusang, in 499 BC, AD. That's 500 years into after Christ. That they documented different civilizations that occurred, you know, like the Aztecs, etc., this way, and told those stories back to their lands, because they would come and migrate and spread their own word within, you know, for a number of decades, you know, like 30 years, and then go back home to the homeland. So there's a lot of history, but I think a lot of things that are going to be revealed as we get further into this topic.
Which indicates that there was a whole history of America that goes way back, long before the so-called discovery of Columbus.
Right. Mm-hmm. And what was the country that, quote unquote, we know that Italy and Europe, et cetera, this way are very popular in the game soccer, but was it, I'm talking only from the European side, not from the Olmec side on the Americas. Aurora, do you know if it was the Greeks or anyone playing with a, you know, like a soccer game? There was beg pardon?
The predates the Olmecs?
Well, yes, because the Olmecs were basically, say it's 3,511 years ago, and they had not only the blood rituals, but they played the game just as the other games.
Like the Mayan civilizations and everything is similar to like basketball. It's very